How you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I'm just trying to get things started right now. I was a little bit late because of the other class. I guess I had to do some work with them. But anyway, let me get started and then we. Uh, so, how does it look now?
It looks good.
Okay. So, hopefully, I should get this now. Once we record all of this, hopefully, I should be able to retrieve it on iCloud because once the recording is done, it takes them about 2 hours to send me the link. Zoom obviously is the one that sends me the link for the recording. Otherwise, I won't be able to retrieve it because I'm not recording on my computer. It's all done on iCloud. So we'll see. Once this recording finishes, I'll go to the link. Sometimes, they send me the link, but when I go through the link, I only find 2 minutes being recorded. And sometimes there is nothing recorded. And this is a problem. I don't know the reason for it, but that's what it is. And sometimes we're lucky. We get the whole lecture recorded. So it depends. As I said, I really have no way to affect this outcome. It's all up to them to. Okay, let's go back to chapter 2. I guess we pretty much finished chapter 2. There are a few things that I need to go over as far as chapter 2 is concerned, because chapter 2, as I said last time, it really deals with these three development phases that the MENA region went through, which caused a lot of transformation in both social, economic, and political as a result of this strategies that were used by the MENA region. The first phase was the ISI, and the second phase was the structural adjustments that most of the MENA region had to go through. And the last phase, of course, was the export-led growth phase. Now, each phase had its own sort of impact and effects on the socio-economic sphere, if you will, of the MENA region. And this is basically what we were interested in. We were interested to find out what are those changes that have occurred in the MENA region during this phase, or during these three phases, starting from 1960 to 2010. We looked at the economic growth during that period, and we were able to determine that the MENA region did pretty well when compared to other countries. In other words, they did much better than the low-income countries. They did better than the middle-income countries, but obviously they fell short of the high-income countries or the industrialized countries, and also fell short of Southeast Asian countries. The Southeast Asian countries, of course, are South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Hong Kong. Those are the Southeast Asian countries that we're talking about. And those countries did extremely well. The MENA region were not able to catch up with these countries. In fact, if you look at Egypt, the Egyptian economy and the South Korean economy, in 1960, Egypt's economy was much higher than that of South Korea. But in 1980s and up, you see that the South Korean overtook the Egyptian economy, and now probably the Egyptian economy is half that of the South Korean. So you can see the advances that were made in Southeast Asia, and the progress in the MENA region was not very, very promising. Even though, as I said, some of the countries in the MENA region did very well simply because of the resources that they had, oil. And other countries that did not have oil did not do very well. But overall, when we look at the average growth for the MENA region as a whole, you see that they have made some progress. They have grown. They did better, as I said, than low income and middle income countries, but did not do as well as the industrialized and Southeast Asian countries. And obviously there are many reasons why that didn't happen. It's basically, it's more political than anything else. In other words, in order to have economic reforms, you have to have political reforms. If you don't have political reforms, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to carry out economic reforms, as many countries in the MENA region have found. Especially today, for example, if you look at the state of the economies in the MENA region, you see that most of these economies are in turmoil. They're in turmoil simply because of the political conditions. So political conditions, dire political conditions, always have negative impact on economic prosperity in terms of foreign direct investment. So if you're politically not secure, if politically you're not stable, you're not going to be able to attract foreign direct investment at all. And this is a huge problem. And also, if you're not politically stable and secure, you're not able to introduce important economic reforms that are needed for the economy to move forward. And most of the countries in the MENA region have been stuck in their dire political conditions. They have not been able to create what we call, remember last time when we talked about development trajectories, all of these development trajectories basically depend on political agreements, coming up with political agreements, coming up with political consensus. You have to have everyone buy into whatever agreement these countries reach within themselves. In other words, if you look at each society in the MENA region, you find that there are so many differences. And all of these differences are not based on economic, but they're based on political. So that's a huge problem based on political, religious, ethnic. So they never talk in terms of trying to discuss economic policies or economic issues and make that to be the issue that they need to find agreements around. It's always about political, it's always about religious, it's always about ethnic. And this is a huge problem. So if the MENA region cannot find a social contract that can please everyone, or at least get a consensus by everyone in society, and lure around that social contract and give it support so as to be able to move to the next step, which is economic reforms, then most of the countries in the Arab region will continue to suffer and will continue to lag behind. So, one of my recommendations have always been the same for the MENA region. And the recommendation is very simple. It really has nothing to do with economics. The solutions to economic problems are a lot easier than the solutions to the political. So first, you really have to find a consensus around the political structure, around governance. You have to agree on the type of governing system that you want to have. And if you make everyone content with this, in other words, if you're able really to have everyone move in the same direction and jump on the bandwagon, if you will, then finding solutions to the economic problem is really not going to be that difficult, especially with the resources that these countries have. So first things are first, political reform. This is the key. Agreements on a social contract. This is a key. If they can agree on all of these things, then obviously everything else becomes pretty easy to solve. It's not going to be a problem for these countries, obviously, to find solutions. And we looked at the import substitution industrialization, of course, and we found what the problems were with that. And I'm not going to repeat them. We discussed them last time, and I have them listed here in your notes. So you can obviously go back and look at them. We talked about the structural adjustment and economic reform. Again, this is very important. You have to zero in on that and make sure you know what the structural adjustment is. And why did it take so long for the MENA region countries to get over the hump? And as far as the structural adjustments are concerned, the reforms as well that were dictated by the World Bank and the IMF in terms of economic reforms, why did it take so long? And this is another problem that we really have to find out why that was the case. Can anyone very quickly tell me why did the structure adjustment take so long? Why did it take 10 years for these countries to make the necessary structural adjustments?
The political process is very slow.
Very good. Yeah, the political process is very slow. And what else? Now, when we talk about structural adjustment, what are we talking about here?
A lot of what's called cronyism in the markets or evil actors in government.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of the problems. But when we talk about the structural adjustment, what are we actually talking about? Adjustments in as far as what? What are we trying to make the adjustment towards here?
Is it the attitude of the people?
Yeah, the attitude of the people, as well as we're trying to adjust from a semi-socialist economy to a market-based economy. This was basically the structure adjustment, because when we started with the ISI strategy. The ISI strategy was undertaken in the most part by the government, by the state, because it was the state that obviously had the resources to carry on such an expensive strategy, which is the ISI strategy, that required billions of dollars of investment in a lot of the sectors and a lot of the projects that were undertaken to make sure that the ISI can move forward. In other words, the private sector was not able to even come close to thinking about undertaking such projects or such investments. They didn't have the billions of dollars that we're talking about here. So the state was the only one. And as a result, you had what we call a quasi or semi-socialist state that was actually running the economy. Now, obviously, that did not work very well because of the reasons that some of you already gave: cronyism, the political process is kind of feudal, weak, etc. So there were a lot of problems. As a result, the the global financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, they came up with recommendations, and they said, well, maybe this is not the best way to do it. Maybe what you need to do is you need to transform your economy, make the transition, make the adjustments, structural adjustments. in your economy to be able to move from a semi-socialist system to a market-based system. In other words, you have to give the helms to the private sector to take over. And the state, like, the way we try to refer to it, the rollback of the state. In other words, the state is going to take the back seat and let the private sector take the initiatives and give the private sector more of the responsibilities to produce goods and services, to provide jobs, etc., etc. So this basically was the whole idea behind the structural adjustment. And this was the main idea behind these recommendations that were given by these global institutions to strengthen the private sector, to cut waste, to reduce inefficiencies, to put the economy on the right track, so to speak. But this took a long time. Took 10 years. Should have taken a lot less, but obviously it took a long time. And the main reason, of course, was, first of all, decision makers were scared to make the adjustment because this simply meant that government expenditure will be reduced tremendously. And the government could not afford that, because if you do that, what are you going to be asking for, right? What will be the result of that? Reducing government spending.
They would have to ask for taxes?
No, what will it do if the government reduces government spending? What would happen politically? Is this possible?
They would have less to offer their people.
Exactly. You're going to see riots. You're going to see complete chaos. In other words, law and order would be extremely difficult to maintain under those circumstances. So the governments, the states in the MENA region were simply buying time. And they were postponing the structural adjustment. They were saying, well, let's wait and see what happens. Maybe things get better. Maybe we will get better at these things. Maybe the ISI will take us to places we never dreamt of. Maybe the ISI will be the solution down the road. Maybe. Everything was maybe. And as a result, they postponed the drastic decline in government spending. Because remember, the MENA region was basically a welfare state. The government was responsible for everything. And the people expected the government to do everything for them because they felt that under the constitution, the government has to guarantee all the basic needs of society. And that's what the constitutions in the MENA region pertains to, that there's a constitutional guarantee for the government to provide basic services in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of food subsidies, energy and fuel subsidies, etc. So those are things that the government could not get away from. And if they did, they're going to be facing a lot of problems. And that's really what delayed the structural adjustment, which obviously caused a lot of problems. In other words, it simply meant added cost. The longer you postpone it, the more the costs you will be incurring. And as a result, the governments in the MENA region found that to be exactly the case. So if you look at a lot of these countries, you'll find that their national debt increased probably between 3 to 6 folds. That's huge. You can't be running huge national debts because of the interest that you're going to be paying, which obviously would distort national economic policies at home. And also you have to end up ultimately paying off everything that you have borrowed. In other words, nothing is given to you for free. So when you're borrowing money, I mean, there's a lot of cost attached to it. And this will obviously break the balance, the national economic balance that a lot of these countries were accustomed to. And all of a sudden you find that your economy is out of whack. In other words, there is a lot of macroeconomic imbalances that will result from taking such a strategy. And this is exactly what happened in most of the MENA region countries. And if you look at your textbook, there are certain tables that basically shows you the amount of national debt that each country in the MENA region had to incur during the structural adjustment period. And you see that there was a huge increase of national debt during that period. Anyway, so there are a lot of problems, of course, and the challenges also we were able to discuss in as far as the export-led growth. So, I mean, everything has a cost, as we all know in economics. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So if you undertake the ISI, there is a cost. If you undertake the export-led growth, there is a cost. There are costs and challenges everywhere. The most important thing here, of course, is to have some sort of balance between the benefits and the cost. And this is a lot easier said than done in the real world. In the real world, it's extremely difficult to come up with this balance. And that's why sometimes, you know, when we talk about economic theory, the economic theory is basically based on the neoclassical school of thought, which says that the economy is always in equilibrium. So everything is analyzed and everything is studied in terms of equilibrium. But the real world, there's no such thing as equilibrium. I mean, everything is in disequilibrium, basically. Usually markets in the real world are not in equilibrium. Most of the time they're in disequilibrium. And to me, of course, I don't know, by definition, of course, I know what equilibrium is, but the state of equilibrium is something that the real world hardly gets to know. So most of the time we're talking about disequilibrium. That's why the study of disequilibrium in macroeconomics and also in microeconomics should be given more credence than equilibrium analysis. And this really, you know, when it comes to economics, this will take us obviously to looking at economics from a dynamic point of view rather than from a comparative static point of view, because comparative static really puts a lot of emphasis on equilibrium, whereas dynamic analysis really looks more at disequilibrium. But, you know, we're really not going to go into that. Hopefully those of you who like to delve more into economics and go to graduate school, you obviously will have a lot of time going through dynamic models and finding out what disequilibrium is, etc. But in the real world, that's what it is. That's the picture that you will see in front of you. It's a picture of disequilibrium rather than equilibrium. And in MENA region, just as in all other countries, disequilibrium basically is a fact of life, and you have to deal with it, and you have to make sure that the most important thing here, of course, is make sure that you're using your resources in the most efficient manner, basically, and trying to keep tabs on your domestic macroeconomic policies as well. In other words, have a sense of sound economic management. This is extremely important, and this really has to do with stable macroeconomic policies, which is basically fiscal and monetary. Those are the most important macroeconomic policies. And then, of course, we have exchange rate policies and we have trade policies that are also important. But the most important policies that we have to focus on are the monetary and fiscal. And we have to make sure that these two policies are sound and are effective and are well coordinated. And if we do that, then we probably have pretty much secured, I would say, 60% or a little bit more of the necessary solution that we need to make sure that the economy can prosper, that the standard of livings will increase for everyone, production and income increases, etc., because those are the macroeconomic objectives. Jobs are plentiful, etc. So in order to do all of that, you really have to start with your macroeconomic policies and strategies, make sure that they are in place, and make sure that they are sound, effective, and well coordinated. Okay, so basically those are some of the problems that the MENA regions have faced, and this is not unique to the MENA region, by the way. This is something that all economies go through. The only difference is that some economies are able to manage their economies a lot better than other economies can, either because of experience or because of having the right people in the right place. You know, there are many reasons, and I really don't want to go into that here, but I mean, you know, it's a very, very broad subject, and it will take us to a lot of things which I don't want to go into, because if we do, then we will never be able to finish what we have to finish here at hand. So the reasons for market reform failures in the MENA region, we discussed those last time, if you remember, and they're listed for you right there. Lack of necessary political reforms, which we talked about, the creation of crony capitalism. Markets are highly monopolistic. Informal markets are dominant instead of the formal markets. Economic growth is lopsided. In other words, lack of diversification. And this is a huge problem. In other words, when we talk about economic growth, we're usually talking here about unbalanced economic growth. We should really have balanced economic growth. In other words, economic growth that really comes not only from one sector or two, but basically from all sectors in the economy. That's where economic growth is balanced. And if you have a balanced economic growth, you really have put things on the straight path. So unbalanced or lack of diversification is another huge challenge for the MENA region. And then, you know, decision makers are usually myopic. In other words, short term. They always think in short term rather than long term. In other words, they are always interested in what they're going to have today versus what you need to do in order to keep the economy growing and pretty much balance short term with long term strategic interests. That's something that's lacking in the MENA region, and this is a problem. It's a problem with decision makers, of course. They are pretty much short-sighted, and they can't look far enough. They don't have a vision. A lot of the decision makers and leaders are not visionary, and this is a huge problem. Economic strategies, again, are shaped by politics. So if you don't have your politics intact and in place, you're gonna suffer with your economic strategies, basically. Again, lack of accountability in state institutions. And this is something that we will talk about in much more detail in the next chapter when we talk about governance and state capacity. You really have to have an effective governance system, and you have to have state capacity. If you don't, then all this would lead to a failed state. And some of the countries in the MENA region are pretty much in that state. In other words, they're failed states, like, for example, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Lebanon. All of these are failed states, by the way. Iraq is a failed state. And in other words, we're talking about a country that's very rich in resources, very rich in labor, and is really not doing that well. It's a failed state, and the reason why it's a failed state because of the chaotic political system that they have. In other words, you have Kurds, Sunnis, Shiite. All those three sects don't see eye to eye, and each one looks at the other as being the exploiter. And everyone wants to have their own piece of the cake. And this is a huge problem. So they're really not talking about economic policies. They're not talking about economic strategies. They're really not talking about how to advance their economies and make their people live a better life. All of that to them really means nothing. What is important to them is who's going to be ruling. Is it the Shiite, the Sunni, the Kurds? And if so, by how much? How much is each one going to get? How are they going to be sharing the pie? Is it going to be 33% each, or is it going to be 20% for one, 40% for the others? I mean, what's going to determine all of that? And they're simply bogged down on these percentages. That's all they see in front of them. This is the picture that they see. They don't see that, hey, there is another picture that we need to look at. And the other picture is how to make this country great. This is something that really escapes all of them. Why? Because all of them are bogged down in their own short-term self-interests. And they have no incentive to actually talk about the performance of the state as a whole, the general welfare of the country as a whole. They really don't think in those terms, but they simply think in terms of a particular sect. Will the Sunni be better off? Will the Shiite be better off? Will the Druze be better off if we pursue a certain policy? And this is one of the problems in the MENA region, unfortunately. I mean, if they continue to think in these terms, I don't know. I really don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. It's just going to be a long, dark tunnel for those countries. And they will continue to be driving in those tunnels for a long, long time in the dark. Not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So, if you look at Iraq, look at Iraq. They got rid of Saddam Hussein when? In 2003? That's what, 17 years ago? Look at Iraq today. They can't even provide electricity for the people. The capital of Iraq, Baghdad, sometimes stays 15 hours in the dark. You'll be lucky to get 5 hours of electricity every day. Now, is this a country that really produces oil and supplies probably close to 4 million barrels of oil a day? Well, a big question mark. Same thing with Libya. Libya that produces a lot of oil and sells a lot of oil. Someone is telling me recently that for the past 2 months, they were able to get 1 hour of electricity every day. So 23 hours, no electricity. 1 hour, if they are lucky, they're going to get electricity. Now, how, I don't know. Sometimes, it's very, very difficult. And it all has to do with politics. It really has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with resources. It has to do with politics. People are simply, and in Libya, by the way, the population is pretty uniform. So you don't have Shiite, you don't have Christians, you don't have Druze, it's all Sunni, basically. I mean, 100% Sunni Muslims. And I would say probably 90% Arabs. You have probably 10% between Berbers and African descent. Just 10%. African descent and Berbers. 90% are Arabs, Arab origin. So you can see the population and the religion and the ethnicity are pretty much uniform. But still, there are a lot of problems. And the problems here are basically political. You have problems that arise between the Muslim brotherhoods and those who believe in a much more secular state. So secularism versus Islamism, basically, in Libya. This is one of the problems that you see happening. And a lot of sects in Libya are taking sides. You find those certain sects within the Libyan society are taking sides with the Turks. And you have other sects taking sides with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, France, and some are with the Russians, and some are with the Italians. And it's a big, big problem. And when you have a lot of these foreign powers intervening in these countries, it's going to make the solution a lot harder to get to. Unfortunately, the MENA region, all the countries in the MENA region, they have a lot of foreign powers meddling with them for different reasons. Some for geopolitical reasons, others are for resources, others are for simply political views. I mean, it's a mess. Let me put it this way: in the MENA region, it's a complete mess, complete chaos. And sometimes I wonder if these countries will ever be able to get out of the hole that they have dug for themselves. Very, very difficult. Very difficult. It really requires leaders that are visionary, leaders that are honest, leaders that have a plan, and leaders that are nationalistic. In other words, they really want to work for the benefits of the country and for the people of the country. And so far, I don't think that these leaders are available with these type of qualities that I just gave you. They're simply not there. And as a result, most of the countries in the MENA region will continue to be immersed in this type of challenges, problems, futility, weaknesses, etc. Okay, and again, technological change and innovation in the MENA region has been extremely low. And the reason, of course, is because of the lack of incentives. In order to have technological change and innovation, you have to introduce a lot of incentives. Unfortunately, nobody really cares about these incentives. A lot of the decision makers are simply interested in finding ways and means to remain in power forever. And for them to enjoy the good life for them, their families, and close entourage. That's all they're interested in, period. Nothing else comes to mind to them. So when you want to talk about technological change and innovation, I think the MENA region is very, very far from there. As I said, simply because the right seeds have not been sown yet in the MENA region. You really have to sow the seeds, the right seeds, to be able to harvest later on. But if you have no seeds, how are you going to harvest? Harvest what? You really haven't built or plowed anything, basically. So those are some of the problems. And as you see, the challenges are huge, and they're very, very scary, by the way. Scary in the sense that a lot of people are becoming extremely pessimistic. Optimism really has been shot completely, and people are simply pessimists, and you don't blame them. I mean, I have traveled to Libya. I mean, I do travel once a year to Libya. This year, of course, I wasn't able to travel because of the coronavirus, but usually, you know, I do a lot of research, and I do a lot of advising as well, and I do, you know, a lot of combined research with the University of Tripoli. You know, there are some bright graduate students over there, and they're very much interested, basically, in doing a lot of research and finding solutions. They are a lot more interested than the leaders themselves, believe it or not. And these are just graduate students, kids, you know, 24, 25 years old, kids, basically. And they have better ideas, a lot better ideas than those who are actually in the helm of power, those who are actually making the decisions. You know, it's mind-boggling sometimes, you know, when I talk with these students who have actually helped me with a lot of the research that I was doing on Libya, and still continuing to do that research. But, you know, their problem is the same. The challenges that they face are tremendous. And a lot of the graduate students that I talk to, they're very pessimistic. And I was surprised. I say, hey, you're young. You know, you have a lot ahead of you. You know, you haven't seen nothing from the world yet. You know, life is pretty much ahead of you. Why are you so pessimist? And, you know, when they tell you all these problems and challenges, they simply have no hope. It's a hopeless case, unfortunately. And that's a big problem. So, you know, when we talk about development trajectories, just to summarize this whole thing, when we talk about development trajectories, every country has to have development trajectories. And these development trajectories are simply defined in terms of structural transformation, in other words, structural changes in society. And also in economic changes. So most of these development trajectories are basically defined in terms of structural transformation that are manifested in they're manifested in society, basically. And also these development trajectories are also manifested in the pattern of economic change that occurs in society. So development trajectories are defined in terms of structural transformations in both society and the economy. Now, what shapes this development trajectories? Well, the things that actually shape this development trajectories are basically the rule of law, state capacity, lack of corruption, all of these things which we will be talking about in the next chapter, the rule of law, state capacity, lack of corruption, all of these are extremely important for shaping development trajectories. And if you look at the MENA region, since the liberal economic reforms of the 1980s, you see that political settlements began to show some changes. In other words, you see that the well-connected private sector elite, because of this liberal economic reforms of the 1980s, going from a quasi-socialist state to a market-based economy, this transformation brought with it changes in political settlements. So now when you look at the present political settlement in the MENA region from the 1990s onward, you see that it is the well-connected private sector elite that has actually gained increasing prominence, alongside, of course, the already existing state bourgeoisie that have come as a result of the creation of the SOEs, etc. So this political settlement, of course, made a difference in as far as decision-making is concerned. However, this economic liberalization that came as a result of the structural adjustment, this economic liberalization came without a parallel political opening. In other words, yes, we have economic liberalization. Yes, we did change the structure of the economy from state to private-based economy. That's what economic liberalization did for the MENA region. However, this should be followed by, or not followed by, should be in parallel with political opening. But this political opening really did not come, and or if it came, this political opening has produced what we call a narrow and cronyistic form of market economy. That's what it did, basically. A very narrow and cronyistic form of market economy instead of a dynamic form of market economy that is based on competition. We didn't have that. And also in the 1990s, instead of opening up political space, instead of this economic liberalism leading to this political change, what happened instead was simply you had rulers resorting to co-optation, which we talked about last time. In other words, co-optation simply here means providing subsidies for consumers so as to keep consumers happy and quiet. And that's what we mean by co-optation. And that's exactly what the opening up of political space amounted to. And also, in order to undertake this development trajectories, nations were required to have political settlements. And it is the political and the economic elites that are usually responsible for achieving these political settlements, unfortunately. It's the elites. So it always starts from the top. The elites are the ones who dictate exactly what type of political settlement we're going to see. So you have elites on both the political front and the economic front. In other words, politicians as well as business owners will simply collude with one another to find political settlements that will satisfy the top tier of society, the elites, basically. And then the rest, well, really nobody cares what happens to the rest. It's not something that these elites are going to be worried about. Now, also, if you look at the period from 1970 to 1990, if we look at the economic picture a little bit, focus on the economic picture, you see that during this period, 1970 to 1990, investment rates in the MENA region were between 25 to 27% of GDP. Between 25 to 27% of GDP. Half of this investment was made by the public sector. And much of this investment went basically to establish the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, SOEs. However, the rate of return on these investments were extremely low. And the reason again is simply because large and inefficient investments were basically made that were not sustainable. You know, again, the inefficient use of resources. Sometimes, you know, this investments in the MENA region, sometimes they refer to them as white elephant investments. The white elephant. In other words, there is no such thing as a white elephant, but this is how they tend to refer to them, as white elephant investments. In other words, you have put a lot of money, a lot of good money after bad money, basically. And that's what you're doing with your investment. In other words, most of your investment is inefficient, unproductive, and as a result, the returns are going to be negative. In other words, just to give you an example here, to produce $1 of output in the MENA region, it required twice as much investment as the Asian economies would require. In other words, to produce $1 of output, if you required $6 in the MENA region to produce that $1 of output, in the Southeast Asian countries, you only needed $3 to produce the same output. So this is huge squandering of resources, basically. And with the rollback of the state in the late 90s, public investment fell sharply, simply because of the inefficiencies of the state and the economic adjustments, structural adjustments that were dictated onto the MENA region by the global institutions. The state took the back seat. So we had rollback of the state in the late 90s. And as a result, public investment was reduced sharply. And private investment was not able to fill in the gap. And that was a big problem, because it was felt that once the government takes the back seat, the private sector will jump in and will pick up the slack. However, the private sector did not. In other words, the private sector was pretty much overwhelmed. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the know-how to be able to undertake such huge investments. And this obviously voted negatively for the MENA region. Also, if you look at foreign direct investment and domestic private investment, you see that it was extremely low. There wasn't really much money coming from outside. And also domestic private investment inside was very, very low. And most of these investments, the foreign direct and the domestic private investment, pretty much favored sectors such as mining and real estate. In other words, the oil sector and the non-tradables. That's where most of the investment went to. The oil sector by foreign companies, in other words, foreign direct investment simply went to the oil sector. And then whatever domestic private investment you had, it was attracted towards the non-tradables. Now everyone knows what the non-tradable sector is, right? Anyone? Non-tradable. What's non-tradable sector? It's the construction, real estate, retail, mostly services that you cannot trade with the outside world. Well, we call that as the non-tradable sector. So a lot of this investment actually went to the non-tradable sector. And manufacturing basically was left out completely. It's a huge surprise. Why would manufacturing be neglected here? That's beyond my thinking. I don't know why. In fact, when we look at manufacturing, we see that manufacturing in development circles happens to be the road, basically. That's how manufacturing is viewed in the development circles, as basically the road to a dynamic economy, simply because of its positive externalities. And also the possibility of technological upgrading. So with manufacturing, there is always the possibility to upgrade. There is always the possibility to innovate. There is always the possibility to make better production methods with manufacturing. So the spillover effects are tremendous. The linkages are tremendous in manufacturing. And that's why in the development literature, it's always viewed as the vehicle, if you will, or the road to a dynamic and prosperous economy. But unfortunately, in the MENA region, manufacturing was pretty much neglected and took very, very little of whatever investment there was. Now, if you look at the manufacturing value added as a share of GDP, in other words, how much did manufacturing make out of GDP, you see that it averaged close to about 15% in the resource poor, labor abundant, 15% in the RPLA, 6% in the RRLA, only 6% in RRLA, and 10% in RRLP. This is how much manufacturing value added as a share of GDP accounted for. They accounted for 15% in the RPLA, 6% in the RRLA, and 10% in the RRLP, versus 19% in the middle income countries. That's how much manufacturing value added accounted for in middle income countries, 19% of GDP. Whereas in East Asian countries, it accounted for 29%. So there is a huge difference between 29% and 6%, or 29 and 15, or 29 and 10. Now, growth in the MENA, of course, is fueled by oil and non-tradables, rather than by the manufacturing sector. That's where most of the growth in the MENA region comes from. It comes from oil and also from the non-tradable. and very, very little from the manufacturing sector. And this is big, big problem, huge problem for the MENA region. And that's why when we talk about the economies in the MENA region, we always talk about diversification. It's very important to diversify. It's very important to have balanced growth, because if you don't, then you're really going to face all these problems that we just talked about. Okay, now for the 10 or 12 minutes that we have left, I don't think I'm going to start chapter 3. Basically, we will leave that till next time. But what I would like to do is open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions or any misunderstandings or any things that they want to basically
For the presentations, on the topics, were you going to assign one of the 3 bullet points to a group, or what topics would be assigned to what group? Would there be like an Excel spreadsheet showing which one was who? Or
Yes, I will do that. I will show you exactly what each group is supposed to be doing.
Is that possible we can get this early? Because it says in the syllabus that it's due next Tuesday, and I work like 3 or 4 days, so I don't want to be cramming at the end.
Right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is those who have submitted their groups, I'm going to today, later on today, tell you exactly what you need to do.
Thank you.
That would help a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do that. Any other question?
Professor, you had mentioned a year. So when you were talking about that 25 to 20%, 27% of GDP was given to like the state enterprise, what year approximately was that?
Oh, did we talk about the investment?
Yeah, how the like money from the private sector was given to SOE,
Yeah.
and then
That was,
they like were inefficient.
yeah, that was basically during the first phase, the ISI. So you're talking about 1960 to about late 70s. So you're talking about the 60s and 70s, basically.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Okay, then if no more questions, I guess I will leave you now, and hopefully I will try to work on the presentations for you and send you those hopefully later on today. I still have one more class to go. Once I finish with that class, I guess I'll start working on your presentation. It will probably take me an hour or so to figure things out and the format and everything else. And hopefully I'll be able to post that for you later on today. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Also, Professor, for the presentation, I know it's Tuesday and Thursday. Are you going to assign what day we're going, or are we going to pick that?
No, I will assign.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Yeah, please, I mean, when I assign a date, I would like you to stick to that date. In other words, I don't want to have students come to me and tell me, you know what, I can't do it on that day because I have so and so. It's going to make things very difficult for me. So once I assign those dates, I can't change them. Okay, that's very, very important. So please stick with whatever dates I assign. And please do not make changes, because if you do, this is going to mess up my whole thing, and it's just gonna add more work for me, and um, I'd rather not go through that. So once I assign those dates, I expect everyone to adhere to those dates and not to make changes. Unless, of course, there are some extenuating circumstances that are beyond your control, then, we can talk about it. But other than that, just try to make things move smoothly, I guess, and just abide by whatever you see. Okay, so I guess if no more questions, I'll see you on Thursday. And hopefully this recording, I see it's still recording, which is good. And I'm hoping that we will get the full session being recorded. So this way everyone can go back to it and check some of the things that you probably might have missed during the session. Okay, thank you all for attending, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Take care.